there, welcome to another episode of Create Something Today. Now in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how I hand dye cotton fabric. Now I usually work with two types of dyes. I usually work with either the Procion dyes or the RIT dyes, and I'm going to show you both these techniques in today's tutorial, and all the links to these products that I'm using can be found in the description below. So let's get started. Now, I want to talk about what kind of fabric to use. So I always like to dye unbleached cotton muslin fabric. I feel this type of fabric really soaks in the dye really well. The color produced on this fabric is usually the best. That's not to say you can't use any other natural fiber fabric. You could use just another type of cotton. You could use a linen. You can even use raw silk. Raw silk actually dyes well also, but my favorite is to use just unbleached cotton muslin. And I like to cut my fabric down to close to the size of the pattern that I want to use, so that way I can really manage what kind of pattern I'm going to get when I dye the fabric. So for example, I've cut these down to size because I'm going to be making face masks out of this fabric once it's dyed. So I've cut it down close to the size that I need it to be. Now that's not to say that you can't dye, a much larger quantity of fabric. Like this is 2 yards of cotton muslin. You could definitely dye that all in one batch. I would just encourage you to think ahead of what your final outcome, like what are you trying to get out of this fabric once it's dyed? What do you want the pattern to look like? So think through that so that when you are folding the fabric and twisting it in different ways, you can have a better idea of what your final pattern and final outcome should look like. Okay, let's go over the supplies we need when we're working with Procion dye. So of course, first of all, you need Procion dye, and you need urea, and you need soda ash. So these two are dissolved in hot water, and then when the dye is added to that mixture, it will react with the dye just to produce that color, and it acts like an agent to make sure it sticks to the fabric. You need some measuring spoons, and of course whatever you use for your dyeing, you should only use it for dyeing. Don't use these same utensils or these measuring spoons with any regular cooking or anything like that. Reserve this just for your dyeing and craft projects. You need a container for your dye where you're going to dye everything. Definitely you need rubber gloves when you're dyeing fabric, and just some kind of a utensil or a spoon to mix the dye. And this is just a yogurt container. This is 32 ounces, so any container that's 32 ounces. I use this as my measure so I know how much hot water to add. So these are the supplies that we'll need for when we're using the Procion dye to dye the cotton fabric. And also, I do recommend that especially when you're working with the soda ash, that you wear like a protective face cover because this is very dusty, and you don't want to inhale that. So you just want to protect yourself when you're working with the soda ash. Okay, so I'm going to mix a dye bath that's going to be approximately good to dye just about 2 yards of fabric, maybe a little less than 2 yards of fabric. I've already pre-cut all my fabric. But this is approximately about 2 yards, maybe a little less than 2 yards. And my dye formula is going to be 1/3 cup of the soda ash and 1/4 cup of the urea, which I'll measure in here. And then I'm going to measure in 1 tablespoon of the Procion dye, and I'm using teal for my example for right now. And I'm going to first add the soda ash and the urea in here, and then I'm going to take hot water, 32 ounces of hot water. So this is a yogurt container. So 32 ounces of hot water in here. I'm going to dissolve everything, let it dissolve, and then I'm going to add another 32 ounces of hot water, and then I'll add my 1 tablespoon of the Procion dye, and then mix that here and make my dye bath. Okay, so I just finished showing you how I made the dye bath with the Procion dye, and now I want to talk about the RIT dye and how to make a dye bath with that. Now I'm not actually going to make it just yet because I'm not really ready to dye my next batch of fabric, but I want to talk through the process. So similarly to the Procion dye, we're going to use hot water again. So I'm just going to use this yogurt container. So I'll take 32 ounces of hot water and I'm going to pour that into my container. And then instead of the soda ash, you just use regular salt, table salt. And so you'll actually measure 1/3 cup of table salt. Use your measuring spoon. 1/3 of table salt. Dissolve that into the hot water and stir it. Make sure the salt is all dissolved. And then once it's dissolved, then you're going to add 1 cup of the RIT dye. So this dye bath, again, will dye just about 2 yards of fabric. So 1 cup of the RIT dye dissolved in 32 ounces of hot water and 1/3 cup of regular table salt. And then I'm going to go, once I've mixed that up, I'm actually going to add another 32 ounces of hot water, pour that in here and mix it up. And then that dye bath is now ready. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to, wet all my fabrics. I like to do the accordion fold. So once each piece is wet, I will accordion fold it. I'll dip it in the same way that I did for the Procion dye. And then once this is dyed, all the steps that I'm going to explain next will be the same, whether you use the Procion dye or whether you use the RIT dye. Okay, now that our dye bath is ready, the next step is to take all your pieces of fabric or your fabric that you have, and you want to wet it. I just wet each piece of fabric in like lukewarm water, and as you can see here, I accordion folded each piece because I'm going to fold it in half and then I'm going to dip it in the dye bath. So just taking this piece of fabric that's wet, I'm then going to just accordion fold it. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want the dye to just sort of do its own thing and seep into the fabric in different points. And I'm really trying to create that ombre effect. So when I dip the ends of the fabric in, it will be darker on the ends, and then slowly the dye will kind of seep upwards. And this top part of the fabric might just remain in that color, or it will be a lighter shade of the teal. So I'm going for like that ombre effect. So let's go ahead and dip each of these fabric pieces into the dye bath. Okay, so now I have submerged all my fabric pieces into the dye bath, and I'm going to let it sit here for maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And I'm going to come back like 20 minutes and just check on it. I want the ends to get really dark, and I want it to be lighter as it comes up because I want this to be like an ombre effect. So maybe in about 20 minutes, I'll just come back and take some of these pieces and just submerge it a little bit more so that some of the top part gets the dye, but then keep the ends really deep in there so they get darker. So let's just let this sit here for a little while, and then I'll come back and then I'll share with you what the next step is. Now, after I let the fabric soak in the dye bath for about an hour, I squeezed out the excess dye and I just opened up each fabric piece and laid them one on top of each other. And I didn't rinse it yet. As I was laying the fabrics onto this aluminum tray, I just took this RIT Color Stay Fixative spray, and I just sprayed, you know, each piece of fabric. This just helps to absorb the color and helps for the color to stay longer. So I sprayed it with that, and my next step is I'm gonna take each individual piece of fabric and rinse it in cool water. And the dye will, some of the dye will come out, which is normal. We want that excess dye to be removed. So I will just rinse it until the water is clear. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this in my dryer so that it will dry with the heat, and it will just fix the color even more. So those will be my next steps. So I'm going to rinse in cool water, and then I'm going to put everything in the dryer to dry. Okay, so this is what the fabric will look like after it comes out of the dryer. You can see that the color is lighter than it was before when the fabric was still wet. And of course it is extremely wrinkled, and that means we need to iron our fabric on a cotton setting. I usually add water so that I can have the steam also in my iron. So you just want to make sure you iron each piece of fabric, get it all smooth. And there we go, our first hand-dyed piece of fabric. Thanks so much for joining me today in this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new about hand dyeing cotton fabric. And remember to subscribe so that you will be notified when my next tutorial is up. And of course, sign up also at divineny.com, where you'll get my monthly newsletter. I share tips, design tips, I share my new product launches, all kinds of things like that. So I will see you again soon. Thanks.